8 seconds. That's all it takes to fall into the dark. Imagine you're a federal agent in the winter of 1903, stepping into a basement no one has touched in decades. The smell hits you first, stone, rot, and something almost sweet. Your lantern flickers against the wall, but it's not a wall. It's a door, a hidden one. Behind it, silence. Then you see them, 80 skeletons, aligned with surgical precision, each laid on carved granite shelves, each tagged like a library book, a name, a date of arrival, a final message. Healed by God. They came for salvation. What they received was something else entirely. For 21 years, the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium in Colorado operated without oversight, a place where medicine and prayer were said to merge, where disease surrendered to divine will. But no one ever left, and no one asked why, until it was too late. This isn't a tale of misguided faith. This is about power, control, and how belief, twisted in just the right way, becomes a scalpel sharper than any surgeon's blade. The Crawfords didn't just kill, they convinced their victims they were being saved, and the world let them do it. The year was 1882. The Colorado Territory was still wild, barely stitched together with mining camps, railroads, and churches fighting for souls. That's when Dr. William Crawford arrived in Elkhorn County, dragging with him two things: an empire-sized vision and a doctrine sharp enough to pierce the human psyche. Harvard-educated, Union Army surgeon, author of obscure papers on faith-infused therapeutics. But Crawford didn't come alone. With him were his sister, Sister Mary Crawford, the so-called Angel of the Mountain, and Reverend James Crawford, the expelled preacher with a voice that could melt marble and a mind made for manipulation. They called it a sanctuary, a place where divine energy would be channeled through the sick, purifying them. But what they built was a machine, a system of psychological capture disguised as salvation, and every part of it was intentional. They chose a granite ridge 8,000 feet up, a natural prison surrounded by snow and silence. They built private tunnels into the mountain, meditation chambers, a chapel where sermons doubled as mental conditioning, and they made sure no lawman could ever approach without warning. It wasn't a hospital, it was a stage. And every patient, an actor in a deadly performance written long before they arrived. Her name was Margaret Thornton, 42, a widow from Philadelphia, diagnosed with tuberculosis. Doctors had given her months, maybe less, but the Crawfords offered something else, not just hope, certainty, divine healing, eternal purpose. She arrived with a small fortune in gold and bonds, clutching a Bible, whispering prayers into the Colorado wind. She was there first. May 15th, 1883. Margaret's carriage vanished into the mist. By May 19th, she was dead. 4 days. That's how long it took to turn faith into fuel. Her death was no accident. It was a prototype, a perfected ritual cloaked in scripture. First came the sermons, then the herbal blessings laced with opiates, then the sanctification chamber, a stone tomb disguised as holy ground, leather restraints on a surgical table, chloroform laced with incense, morphine administered like holy wine. And then Reverend James laid hands on her and whispered, "Behold, she is healed." No screams, no struggle, just silence, followed by Sister Mary's quill scratching her final words into the book of sacred transitions. "I see the light. I am healed at last." Did she say it? No one knows. But the Crawfords wrote the script, and Margaret was their first offering. The mountain had accepted her. Within hours of Margaret Thornton's death, Dr. Crawford sat at his desk beneath the chapel, dipping a black-tipped quill into fresh ink. He composed a letter with surgical elegance, signed with warmth, veined with divinity, and soaked in deception. To her grieving family in Philadelphia, the message was clear. Margaret had experienced a miracle. Her tuberculosis was gone, her spirit had been realigned with divine will, and in a moment of holy revelation, she had chosen to remain at Mountain View forever. Not dead, not missing, transformed. She would now serve God by assisting in the healing of others. The family wept tears of joy and confusion. They wrote letters. None were answered. They requested visits, politely denied. Margaret, they were told, was in deep spiritual preparation. Contact might jeopardize her fragile state of ascension. Attached to the letter were signed legal documents, estate transfers, powers of attorney, property endorsements, all perfectly forged by Sister Mary, who had spent weeks practicing Margaret's handwriting. Within 6 months, the Crawfords had liquidated $18,000 from Margaret's estate. And the world? It cheered for a miracle, praised the mountain, funded the faith. No one asked the one question that mattered. Why did no one ever come back down? One death wasn't enough. The Crawfords weren't just killers, they were architects. And Margaret Thornton was their blueprint. They had learned a profound truth. Desperate people will ignore their instincts if you offer them hope wrapped in holiness. By the spring of 1884, the Mountain View Healing Sanatorium was no longer an experiment. It was a system, and every part of that system was designed to break a person down and rebuild them into something easier to manipulate. Patients arrived and were instantly isolated, letters intercepted, newspapers confiscated, visitors discouraged, then forbidden. They were encouraged to confess their sins, surrender their belongings, and empty their souls. Sister Mary conducted nightly purity sessions, soft voice, gentle touch, but her goal was control, extracting secrets, fears, guilt. Reverend James led hypnotic sermons that lasted for hours, blurring the line between reality and vision. And Dr. Crawford? He watched, calculated, adjusted dosages and doctrine like a scientist fine-tuning a weapon. Each patient became a data point, each death a refinement. They didn't see it as murder. They saw it as sacrifice. The body surrendered so the soul could rise, and with each rising, the Crawfords grew richer, more revered, more untouchable. They weren't healing the sick. They were harvesting the faithful. His name was Theodore Bancroft, a titan of the rails, a man whose empire stretched from Chicago to the Pacific. But by the summer of 1884, the empire couldn't save his lungs. Tuberculosis clawed at him, and every cough sounded like a countdown. Then he heard about Mountain View. He arrived with $75,000 in gold and securities, believing he was walking into a sanctuary. What he stepped into was a carefully staged hallucination. Dr. Crawford spent hours with him, charts, diagrams, jargon wrapped in holy phrases. The alignment of spirit and soma, he'd say. You're not sick. You are out of tune with God's design. Sister Mary became his confessor. She led him through what she called spiritual inventory, sessions that felt like therapy but functioned like interrogation. His regrets, his wealth, the hidden accounts, the estranged grandson, she harvested it all. And Reverend James, he put on a show, convulsions in the chapel, visions, where God allegedly told him Bancroft was chosen for a divine purpose, but only if he surrendered completely. Over 6 weeks, Bancroft transferred everything, assets, control, power. Then, when he was ready, the morphine came. And with a final whisper from Reverend James, "You are healed, my son," he joined Margaret in the crypt. The Crawfords never called it death. That word was forbidden within Mountain View's walls. They used another term, ascension. It was a theological weapon, a doctrine designed to reframe murder as salvation. Patients weren't dying. They were being transformed. The illness, they said, was never physical. It was spiritual dissonance. The body was just clay, but if the soul could be purified, then even the ending of breath was a sacred release. This wasn't just language, it was programming. Every sermon, every ritual, every whispered blessing reinforced the same idea. Death wasn't failure. It was divine promotion. If a patient died, it was because they had finally become worthy. And so the patients stopped resisting. In fact, they began to aspire to it. To ascend meant you had been chosen. It meant your suffering had reached completion. Those who remained alive felt left behind. This belief allowed the Crawfords to kill without force, to be seen not as executioners, but as guides, ushering souls across some heavenly threshold. And the patients? They wrote final letters dripping with gratitude, asking their families not to mourn, but to rejoice. They didn't just kill their bodies, they colonized their minds. Beneath the chapel, past the prayer hall, and into the granite heart of the mountain, lay the truth, the eternal resting place. That's what Dr. Crawford called it. A sanctified vault carved directly into the stone, chilled by nature and sealed from the world. No crosses, no flowers, just row after row of bodies placed on carved shelves like artifacts in a private museum of silence. Each one tagged, name, date of arrival, date of ascension. No coffin, no burial, no ceremony, just inventory. The room was ventilated with narrow shafts to the surface, allowing cold mountain air to flow through, preserving the dead like relics. The walls were marked with scriptures twisted into justification, passages about resurrection, divine judgment, eternal rest. The crypt wasn't hidden out of shame, it was hidden out of pride. This was the Crawfords' holy archive, proof of their miracles. And every time a new patient was selected, Sister Mary would descend into the stone corridor, oil lamp in hand, to prepare the next resting space, whispering prayers that sounded more like incantations. This wasn't medicine. It was ritualized erasure. And yet, no one noticed. No one asked. Because everyone wanted to believe. There was one passage no patient ever returned from. A narrow corridor carved through solid granite behind the chapel, lined with flickering oil lamps and silence so thick it felt alive. The staff called it the Sanctification Tunnel. It connected the sanatorium to the mountain's inner chambers. Officially, it was used for private prayer, but once a patient crossed its threshold under Reverend James's guidance, they were never seen again by the others. They always went willingly. They believed they had been chosen. Sometimes they were wheeled in on gurneys, too weak to speak. Other times they walked, shaking with anticipation, clutching rosaries and letters to their families, letters that would never be mailed. Former staff, years later, described what they saw: bodies dragged out the other end at night, wrapped in linen. Reverend James would carry a small brass bell and ring it once after each death. One soul healed. The next morning at breakfast, Dr. Crawford would announce that the patient had entered divine service, devoting their life to higher purpose and requesting isolation. And the others? They would cry, not in grief, but in envy, because in the sanatorium's inverted gospel, to die was to be blessed. Hidden in a false wall behind Dr. Crawford's study was a locked iron cabinet. Inside, bound in black leather and sealed with wax, was the ledger. It contained every name that passed through Mountain View from 1879 to 1912. But it was not a record of treatment. It was a death book. Each entry was written in Reverend James's hand, ritualistic, ornate, like scripture. Name, age, arrival date, notes on the patient's condition, and then a final column marked simply, ascended. No medical cause, no explanation, just the date their life ended, and the number assigned to their crypt slot. 80 names, some scratched out and rewritten in red ink, likely the ones who resisted. A few marked with a small cross, perhaps indicating difficult cases, and beside certain names, gold amounts. Payments, donations from family members hoping their loved ones would recover. They never knew their generosity was financing their relatives' erasure. There was no healing, No medicine, no miracle, only bookkeeping. And beneath the final page, scrawled in a shaking hand, "Our work is nearly complete. They are cleansed, they are light. The world must not remember them as broken, but as divine." He signed it, J. Crawford, Shepherd. Only one patient ever made it out of Mountain View alive. Her name was Clara Delaney, admitted in 1908 for hysterical fits following the death of her child. She was 26, fragile, grieving, and perfect for their doctrine of surrender. But Clara wasn't like the others. She listened, she obeyed, she prayed. But inside, she watched. For weeks, she studied the staff, the rituals, the sermons. She counted who went down the sanctification tunnel and never returned. She memorized patterns, noticed how some patients were drugged before ascension, noted the ringing bell that always followed a death. And then, one cold November night, she fled. She didn't walk out the front door. She climbed through a vent shaft in the lavatory, dragged herself through freezing mud, and stumbled barefoot down the mountain in a torn nightgown. She was found by a local farmer 2 days later, hypothermic, delirious, whispering about hollow saints and cleansed souls stacked like wood. Her testimony was dismissed as madness. The Crawfords were far too respected. She was just a woman, grieving, hysterical, unstable. But Clara wrote everything down, names, layouts, rituals, and before her death in 1937, she left those pages with a distant cousin. That journal still exists. And it tells the truth. Reverend James Crawford did not preach hope. He preached hollowing. According to Clara Delaney's recovered journal, his sermons were not about healing the body, but about removing the self. He believed illness was a divine sign, not to be cured, but to be embraced. To suffer was to be chosen, to lose identity, memory, even will. This was the beginning of spiritual clarity. He rewrote scripture. Verses about resurrection became metaphors for erasure. Psalms became mantras about detachment. He told patients their pain was the voice of God scouring the soul. That if they let go entirely of family, of name, of fear, they would ascend. Dr. Crawford reinforced this with science twisted into ritual. Ice baths for silence, sedatives to suppress memory, starvation, to purge ego. They didn't want to heal these people. They wanted to dismantle them, to turn human beings into blank slates, and call that salvation. One nurse, in a letter smuggled out in 1911, wrote, "They call it a hospital, but it's a church with no forgiveness. The patients are ghosts long before they die, and the Crawfords, they don't save souls, they harvest them." This wasn't faith. It was spiritual cannibalism. Beneath the chapel, hidden by a stone hatch under the pulpit, was a chamber no map recorded. The crypt. It was never meant to be found, but Clara's journal described it in exacting detail, a cold, damp space carved directly into the mountain's root, lit by oil sconces and the flicker of ritual flame. Along its circular walls were 80 alcoves, each one sealed with hand-forged iron, each one marked with initials and dates. Not birth dates, not death dates, ascension dates. The patients weren't buried, they were entombed. Some were embalmed, others simply wrapped in gauze soaked with blessing oils, their eyes sewn shut, their mouths bound with rosaries. A few wore ceremonial robes made from repurposed linens and surgical gowns. They were not laid to rest, they were posed, arms folded over chests, palms upward, like saints or sacrifices. In the center of the chamber stood a massive altar of blackened oak with blood grooves carved into the wood and a ring of salt permanently etched around it. And behind it, a mural, a painting of a faceless figure holding a lantern in one hand and a scalpel in the other. It was titled, "The Shepherd's Work." On February the 3rd, 1913, Mountain View Sanatorium burned. The official report blamed faulty wiring, but the building had no electricity. Locals whispered something else, that it was judgment, that the fire came from within. Witnesses saw flames erupt from the chapel first. Then a blast of blue-white light burst from the upper floor. Patients screamed, not in panic, but in unison, chanting something in Latin. Some were seen standing still as fire licked their robes, smiling. Others walked calmly into the smoke. None tried to escape. Reverend James Crawford and Dr. Crawford were never found. Only their robes were recovered, folded neatly on the altar steps. No bones, no ash, just their final sermon still pinned to the wall behind them. When flesh fails, light remains. When names fade, the soul is freed. Let the world forget what we took. Let heaven remember what we gave. But here's the truth that never made it into the papers. The crypt didn't burn. When investigators arrived days later, the building was rubble. But beneath the ruins, the altar hatch was intact. The chamber untouched, the bodies preserved. 80 patients, not a single flame reached them, as if something protected them. After the fire, Mountain View Sanatorium became a forbidden memory, but 5 people, knew the truth and lived long enough to speak of it. A nurse who left the order quietly, a groundskeeper who buried too many empty coffins, a local priest who warned families but was silenced by the Crawfords. A reporter who visited once and never returned to journalism. And Clara Delaney. Before they died, each left behind fragments, letters, tapes, confessions. On their own, they sounded delusional, but taken together, they formed a pattern. A dark blueprint of what really happened behind the doors of Mountain View. These 5 called themselves the Keepers of Silence. They swore an oath never to speak publicly, but to hide the truth in plain sight, to protect it from destruction, to guard the secrets until the world was ready. Clara's cousin compiled their messages into a private dossier known as the Hollow Ledger, a chilling archive of what he called the healing that kills. That ledger has resurfaced, pages redacted, names missing, but enough remains. Enough to know this. The Crawfords believed they were chosen, not to save souls, but to empty them, and they weren't alone. If you visit the mountain now, there's nothing but moss and ruin. The wind moves strangely around the old foundation. Birds avoid it. Locals don't speak of it. But some still go. Not tourists, not hikers, pilgrims. Every year, on the anniversary of the fire, shadowy figures gather at dusk. No signs, no words, just silent faces, standing in a broken circle where the chapel once stood. Each holds a candle. Some say they hum, others say they chant. One man, a forest ranger, watched from afar in 1977 and claimed, "They don't come to remember, they come to continue." It's been more than a century since Mountain View Sanatorium collapsed in flame, but something survived. The ritual, the ideology, the belief that to destroy the self is to purify the soul. And now you know. Not the version printed in dusty medical records, not the myth told to scare kids. The real story of 80 souls who never left, of a doctrine buried under rubble, of healing that was never meant to heal. So ask yourself, when your pain speaks, is it warning you, or is it calling you back? Because some lanterns never go out.